Now here's something I haven't done before. A few weeks back, the Fire Emblem YouTuber Mecha released a video on the series' support systems. I recommend you go and give that a watch if you haven't seen it already, but the short version is that it's a critique of how supports are almost always at odds with the rest of the game's writing. They rarely reference story events, they're stuck working around permadeath in awkward ways, and because of how they're accessed, they can never showcase consistent character development outside of the progression within an individual support line. Now, all of those statements are true, and Mecha is absolutely right that Fire Emblem's support system has always had fundamental design flaws that come from how it struggles to work around core gameplay mechanics. However, as you might know if you've checked out my channel, I've spent quite a bit of time talking about supports in past videos, and obviously I value them for their character building potential, not to mention the ones that dip into entertaining subtext territory. Many of the clips you'll be seeing in this video I picked out from among my favorite support conversations, because, yeah, I've got a fair number of those. So therefore, I wanted to take some time today to consider the problem with Fire Emblem supports, and if there indeed could be any way to fix them that intelligent systems might feasibly implement, or if we're just stuck with this clumsy mess of a mechanic for most of the franchise's characterization work. Now, as Mecha pointed out, Path of Radiance is just about as close as it gets to a gold standard for how support systems in Fire Emblem can work. It's not perfect, since it keeps the obnoxious 5 support limit per character per playthrough from the GBA games, and there's no in-game support log, which is a real shame for those of us who like filling those up, but it's about as good as it's ever gotten. Building support points is as simple as being deployed on the same maps together. The stat bonuses from support ranks are easy to understand at a glance, and don't require you to have to memorize an entire table's worth of data. And best of all in the writing department, the supports are staggered throughout the story in such a way that they can take major plot events into account. There's even a handful of supports that vary if other characters died in that run, and the incredible rarity of that particular feature is a real testament to just how constrained Fire Emblem support writing is by the need to factor in permadeath. To rely on an especially blatant example from Three Houses discourse, because of course Three Houses discourse gets tangled up in this stuff. One criticism of Dimitri and Dedue's relationship that I often see is that it feels one-sided, with Dedue talking about Dimitri constantly in his supports and other interactions, but very rarely the reverse. No, this isn't an indication that Dimitri actually doesn't care about Dedue, or is completely fine with his friends openly insulting Dedue, but it does highlight that only one of these characters has impenetrable plot armor. Most of Dimitri's supports can't reference Dedue, because the game has no way of knowing if Dedue is alive when the player unlocks that support. On the other hand, any character who's playable in Azure Moon can reference Dimitri, because as a lord he's guaranteed to be alive. Some supports might not make a ton of sense if you get them when he's going through his rough patch in early Part 2, but that's just another artificial quality of support writing that players are expected to accept. It's not a stretch to say that player input is a major factor in why supports are the way they are. Of course, there are many RPGs out there that have done fantastic work with developing their playable characters and giving them the opportunity to engage with the story and the world around them, but that approach is only really feasible on a smaller, more intimate scale. In a tactical war story, where the game has to juggle dozens and dozens of playable units who might not even all get recruited or used by the player, there's substantially more variability to account for. This is where I disagree with something in Mecha's video, when he proposes that all characters should get to have an active role in the story and have their development happen over the course of the game in that way, as opposed to scattered across all these optional support lines that can never reference one another. He admits that doing so would require significantly more effort on the writer's part, especially when it comes to accounting for permadeath, but claims that this effort would be comparable to that of the recent games going for full or mostly full voice acting. I don't really see those two things as equivalent, not in terms of the impact they're going to have on most players. Voice acting is practically an industry standard nowadays, unless you're an indie game or Pokemon, but how many people would even see the many potential permutations of scenes that have to account for characters' possible deaths? Doubly so in modern Fire Emblem, where there are very few missable recruits, the rewind button is immediately at hand, and where hardcore fans have to sell Iron Man runs as the intended way to play these games, since more casual players have been in the habit of resetting their way out of permadeath for decades now. This isn't even touching on the additional artificiality of Fire Emblem's avatars, and how those inevitably muddle the quality of support writing, especially when they're given some kind of narrative preferential treatment over other characters, which is pretty much always the case, whether that's exclusive full access to the dating pool, or the game's only S ranks or paired endings. The simple fact is that the more the writing has to account for the player's actions, the less it can feel entirely coherent or satisfying when it comes to material outside the fixed core of the story that all players will experience. There simply isn't space to accommodate every Fire Emblem character in the main plot, and attempting to do so would only make it even more obvious that IS's trick of repeatedly recycling unit archetypes results in many of these characters being little more than stock figures. It's probably indicative that of the 5 modern Fire Emblem games, it's Echoes that feels like its supports are most properly integrated into the story and rarely ever run up against each other. And that's because it has by far the fewest supports, and offers the player very few options for affecting its character endings. And because when it comes to shipping, its central romance actually is a foundational element of the story. But, how many people like Echoes better than any of the other modern games? Removing player choice just isn't a popular direction to take. Truth be told, I don't think there really is an easy solution to this problem. At least not one that's going to come from the games themselves. But I do believe a shift in perspective can help the player better appreciate Fire Emblem supports for what they're trying to be. It's much easier if you don't think of these games' scripts as a unified whole, but rather as a collection of loosely connected parts, and that just as you're free to obtain whichever support you like in any given run, so too are you allowed to pick and choose which elements of characterization most appeal to you. This is sort of the same approach multi-route games like Fates and Three Houses already encourage, in the way that it's up to the player to decide which characters and factions they view as the most sympathetic. And it does indeed work on a smaller individual level as well. Whether that means something like reconciling the notorious disparity between Xander in the story and Xander in supports, or something even simpler, like allowing for contradictory paired endings to all technically be canon, while still preferring your own favorites. Or even disregarding those options entirely in favor of ones that are more appealing to you. Basically, I'm advocating for everyone to keep in mind that Fire Emblem is written very much like the series of video games that it actually is, and that IS has no grand vision for what they're hoping to achieve with their work short of high sales and fodder for profitable heroes alts. That may just be me being my usual doylist self, but I like that even though I can clearly make out the many flaws inherent in the writing of the support system, I can still catch its little flashes of humor, of poignancy, and of personal resonance from time to time. To me, that's worth more than attempting to make every tiny piece of each game's script fit together in a way that is both well-written and meaningful. So what about you? What do you think about the highs and lows of Fire Emblem support writing? Tell me about it in the comments, and be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel. I'm planning on doing another end-of-year Q&A that will likely include some Fire Emblem-related questions, so you can look forward to listening to me ramble more about the series in the near future. Au revoir!